Hello, my name is Paul Zanazanian, and welcome to History in the Now Conversations, a podcast on history and how we use it in our everyday lives. History in the Now Conversations explores how we use history to know who we are, to know how to think and feel, and to know how to engage in our daily routines. History in the Now Conversations examines what history is, what it does, and how we can use it or even should use it in our everyday lives. Today's guest is Blane Harvey, an associate professor in the Department of Integrated Studies and Education at McGill University. Blane leads the department's Leadership and Learning for Sustainability Lab. He is an interdisciplinary researcher working across the social and natural sciences on the themes of learning, collaboration, and environmental change in education for sustainable development. Blane is interested in the power of transformative and non-formal learning that happens in collectives, especially in the context of higher education. Hello, Blane. Thanks for coming today.
Thanks for having me.
Please tell us, what is it that you do in terms of research and why is it important?
Sure, yeah. So my research basically centers around two big questions. The first is, how do we use collaboration and collective learning to tackle complex global challenges like climate change, where we know that it takes people from all sorts of different backgrounds and all sorts of different knowledge sets to come up with meaningful, transformative kind of solutions. And then the second, which is related to it, is how do we need to transform our educational systems to sort of support that type of learning, that type of collaboration, and build the next generation of people who can help us address these challenges. So that means looking at questions of the way that our universities work, the way that schools assess excellence and learning, and questions of that nature.
There's one idea that came to mind to me today when I was thinking and preparing for our interview, and that is the notion of the unsung hero. A lot of people who work in climate change or in sustainability work really hard. You have a strong rationale to do what you want to do, and it's for the common good. But at the same time, your efforts are not always recognized by the public in general. Is that a fair assessment, or am I exaggerating a little?
I think like any field, you have a lot of people working behind the scenes, trying to make change happen, trying to work in less publicly visible ways to unlock the possibility for change by influencing policies, by getting the ears of decision makers, by changing mindsets of young people about what matters and the state of the world. You also have people who are, if you will, public intellectuals and who are like always on the front page of the newspaper. So it takes all types, I guess. But certainly, I think there's a lot of people whose life's work is dedicated to addressing these very challenging and slow-moving problem spaces who don't get a lot of recognition for the amount of energy and personal investment that they put into it.
So I'm not too far off.
No, not at all.
So what kind of satisfaction do you get from your work?
I work with a team of 12 or so master's, PhD, postdoctoral scholars who are amazing, who do work in all sorts of spaces with K-12 schools, with universities, with social movements. And I think one of the greatest sources of satisfaction that I get is just about helping them to sort of be agents of change in the spaces that they're trying to influence, and seeing them grow and succeed in their capacity to do so. So to me, this is hugely rewarding. I also get the chance to speak to large international forums and things like the UN or elsewhere. And I guess on one level that can feel satisfying or feel like an achievement, but I actually don't think you get to see the real difference that it makes the way you do. I'm sure you can relate when you're engaged in sort of one-to-one teaching, mentorship, learning together, partnership, as we do, through our work at the university.
Could you name one big challenge that you find is difficult to contend with?
Absolutely. I think the trying to make the case for these kinds of issues to be at the forefront of our work at a university. One of the big challenges is that there are so many issues that are often competing for our attention, for our priority, for the investment of our time and our resources when we're thinking about how to pursue positive social change. And so trying to come up with ways that people can act on this at the same time as they are paying attention to other things they care about, other forms of social vulnerability, decolonization efforts, equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts. And so trying to build the case that we can pursue these things in tandem, that we can look for the intersections between the consequences and the risks of climate change and our desire to see kind of advanced decolonization on the university is really tough. It's hard to fathom how to undertake such a complicated social transformation process in like the space of a year or a few years that we have to work on things. Our projects that we have, they're always too short to really feel like you're making the difference you'd like to make. The resources that we have are always too little to do what you would love to see happen. And so trying to make a difference within kind of a context where there's a lot of competition or a lot of pressure on how much time we have, how much resourcing we have, how much attention we can give is difficult.
In a weird way, does that make what you do fun? The fact that you have to problem solve in such a limited amount of time?
It is. I think it can be fun. It can be frustrating sometimes when we know there are things we would like to do that would make a difference, and we can't manage to muster the resources. And that's one of the reasons I look a lot at educational policy, is to say, actually, we should be able to find resources for addressing these things. These are existential questions that the evidence tells us are kind of among the biggest priorities for young people in Canada and worldwide right now. And therefore, we should have the resources to work on it. But as you say, I think trying to have a big impact with limited resources forces us to be creative, and it forces us to think out of the box and to think in innovative ways of how to work with young people. And definitely one of the things I learned from working with young scholars is how innovative they can be with very limited resources.
Very interesting. So I'm very curious to learn more about what led you to do this kind of academic work. What's your life story, as they say? What led you to wanting to work in climate change?
Quite honestly, I came into it a little bit by accident. I think that's often the case with people. I did a master's degree here at McGill in culture and values in education, where I was looking at kind of philosophical issues related to education. And after my master's, was teaching in a university in Australia, teaching English as a second language, when I saw the opportunity for an internship with UN agencies. And the UN agency that I was applied to was called the Institute for Training and Research, designing training programs on climate change for national decision makers in the global south. So, sub-Saharan Africa in particular, and places like that. And I thought this was fascinating, and I was really, really curious about that kind of work. I applied and was not selected, but the person who was selected was turned it down. And as the second place contender, I happened to get the job. I often tell this to students to say, sometimes you're not necessarily the best qualified for the job, but you can sort of manage to get it anyway. And that sort of set off a long kind of path of working in policy, in local level action, working with NGOs and other kinds of organizations that are really doing change on the ground, as well as undertaking research around climate change, development, and social vulnerability. So for the better part of 10 years, I guess, I spent my time working at the intersection between research, policy, and practice before deciding to finally kind of try and move directly into academia.
And that's when you did your PhD.
I did my PhD kind of in the midst of that. Even my PhD research was undertaken. My PhD research was with an NGO in Senegal that was doing climate change work in communities, rural communities there. And I was looking at how their collaborations with international organizations shaped the way that they thought about their practice. So even my doctoral research was really at the intersection of kind of research and practice.
That's interesting. Would you say you're an activist, or is that a dirty word in your field?
Absolutely not a dirty word. I think youth activism is something I'm super interested in. It's not necessarily how I would describe myself, but I would definitely say I'm interested in supporting, in amplifying, in opening up pathways for young people to engage in activism, in direct action, in lobbying, and of work of that nature. And I think trying to understand how young people who engage in that are engaging in collective learning processes. There's an educational theorist, Griff Foley, who talked about learning in action and learning through action, as well as learning in struggle. And so these being engaged in these processes are instructive, and they build your capacity, they build your ability to undertake future action. And so these are really important learning spaces for young people in particular, but I think people of all ages is engaging in these kind of spaces of advocacy, resistance, activism.
And for my purposes, I see a lot of history arising in that kind of work. But before we talk history, I have one question, because you talked about activism and activists, and you think it's a beautiful idea and concept, and it's very instructive. Have you met Greta Thunberg?
Not personally. We've not met in person. We shared the same space on a number of occasions through engagement in UN processes and being at the conferences of parties, but we're not on a first name basis by any stretch.
All right, so let's do some history now. Are you ready?
Sure.
So what's the first idea or image that comes to mind when you think of history? And why do you think?
So for me, in my work, the image that comes to mind when I think of history is Michael Mann's hockey stick graph. So those of you who are familiar with climate science or the sort of like the politicking around climate change might have heard of the hockey stick graph. It is basically a line that starts very flat for a very long time, which represents the concentration of CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere, which once we get to the age of industrialization, takes a very sharp left turn straight up to represent the impacts that industrialization has had on the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. And this has been like a hotly contested visual of just how much we've reshaped our own environment in the space of actually not very long time, maybe 100 to 150 years. When you put that onto a timescale of thousands and even hundreds of thousands of years, and you look at it through this visualizations, it's absolutely fascinating and a little bit terrifying to see to what extent we've disrupted what was for millennia a very delicate balance. So I think putting what looks like very small changes into a much longer historical time scale really brings into focus the extent of which we've had an influence over our environment.
It's very interesting because our current day understanding of memory and history emerged at around that time also.
Fascinating.
Where our space of experience and horizon of expectations started to separate, if I can quote people like Koselleck.
Okay.
With industrialization, you had change and development, and people started realizing that time exists, a linear understanding of time, and this kind of upward arrow towards progress and development taking place.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess you could argue that in many ways time sped up in that moment, and with the sort of the advent of the kinds of technologies that we now have for carbon dating, for looking at the historical record, the planetary historical record using new technologies. It's just given us so much more of a detailed understanding of history, including of ancient history, in ways that have really shone a light on kind of the influence of our present time.
So what is your earliest memory of your connection to history? I'm sure it goes beyond the hockey stick.
Yeah, my earliest memory of my connection to history, I guess probably through my experiences of kind of intergenerational connectedness with my own childhood. As a boy growing up in Northern Ontario, we used to visit my sort of, if you will, my ancestral family farm in Manitoba for family reunions every 3 years. And I was able to do that from a young age, where I have a photo that I still have in a photo album of 4 generations, myself, my father, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather sitting together there. And I think being connected to long familial ties gives us a sense of kind of our position in kind of continuity, and our connectedness to space and to stories that predate us. And certainly the stories that would be shared in these family reunions were all about kind of our family's arrival in Canada, the various roles that have kind of defined our family from farming to teaching and so on and so forth. And make you realize how tied your own kind of path is to people who came before you. I would say that was really formative in my youngest years, 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old.
There's a look of satisfaction on your face talking about what you just said. What's so satisfying about this intergenerational continuity or understanding of your family's history?
I think it gives you a sense of place. It gives you a sense of connectedness. It gives you a view of yourself as being kind of tied into a bigger story. And, I think it opens your eyes to the sort of the fact that you're not acting completely autonomously, as much as you might like to think you are.
That's interesting.
I became an educator kind of out of nowhere. I did my bachelor's degree in second language teaching, and in some ways, I think without a lot of thought that I might want to become one, only to later have it kind of, dawn on me that my father was an educator, my grandfather was an educator, my great-grandmother was a school teacher.
Wow.
And these were not, at no point did I say, well, I'd better become a teacher because everybody else in the family is. But to sort of see how somehow through processes of nurturing and modeling and observation and dialogue, we absorb a lot of these values, these beliefs, and things that are around us.
Became inserted into your DNA practically.
Yeah.
Could you please describe a moment in time where you had to justify the importance of using history for attaining a goal or for making some kind of change, ultimately some positive change through your work, and why? What was your justification? It's a little bit of a drawn out story, but I think it's a useful one for the question. So when we talk about people's observations of and responses to climate change, which is an area that I do a lot of my work on, I think an important thing to recognize is that people have been adapting to changes in our climate for forever. This is people have made sense of, and then responded to changes around them. And that's been kind of core to our cultural survival. And we did this a long time before we had the fancy kind of instruments that we have today for measuring, concentrations of various chemicals in the atmosphere or anything like that. And we did it through observation, through the way we saw changes in our environment. A lot of that gets put under the banner of Indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge in the literature that I work with.
oftentimes it's looked at in a kind of condescending light by some, in a way that sort of diminishes its value or sees it as secondary to quote unquote real science, by which we mean Western colonial models of science, and viewed as somehow folkloric and quaint, when in fact it's been central to the existence of peoples for so long. Some years ago, I worked in a Canadian funding institution where we gave grants on climate change for action research, participatory action research on adaptation to climate change in sub-Saharan Africa. One of the projects that we worked with there was really about kind of learning about Indigenous knowledge and the way that it was sustaining particular groups in Kenya and in Eastern Africa, and observing how the methods that were used and how those compared and contrasted with the methods that were being used by things like the Weather Service, to engage in sort of mutual learning and mutual understanding between kind of Western educated scientists and knowledge holders who'd learned about observing, assessing, responding to patterns through the sort of transmission of ecological knowledge. At one point, the media got a hold of it and started to, in a sense, this is UK media, cast kind of condescending and quite racist, if I'm honest, kind of descriptions of this in the media, and saying this was a waste of taxpayer money. This was a program that was funded by British and Canadian taxpayers, and that this was a waste of taxpayers' money. As somebody who was working on the program, I had to respond to actually a parliamentary question that was raised in the British Parliament on this in writing about why this was valid as research, why going out and looking how people were looking at bubbles that were appearing in puddles and trying to discern trends in the weather by looking at the stars as opposed to using contemporary technology, and why that was relevant and important science. And I think they're having to explain that actually these are deeply, deeply historically tied practices that have sustained populations for millennia, that have huge amounts of public trust invested in them, and in fact are in many cases more trusted than the weather report that comes in from the National Weather Service. I think having to make that case and having to show how this is tied to histories of place, histories of peoples, the ways that knowledge is transmitted from generation to generation and within communities, and the authority that is granted to knowledge that's been held for a long time by community. You know, having to explain all of that to people who in many ways were simply dismissive because it seemed folkloric and silly. This struck me as a really important moment of just seeing how narrowly some groups were looking at how we understand knowledge and how we understand how we come to know certain things.
Some groups with power.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And were you able to convince them?
I mean, as is often the case with political processes, it's hard to know where they end up. I think in many ways, having a response to that and continuing to insist on the value of supporting research that tries to understand these things and tries to engage meaningfully at the sort of the boundaries of different knowledge systems in a respectful and non-colonial way was really important. And I think the growing kind of value or the growing appreciation of the importance of that work is a testament to the fact that, you know, these kinds of dismissive voices are not leading to an abandonment of those conversations. I think that's an important thing that I've seen.
So in a way, you having just responded and having been a part of the conversation was a victory in and of itself.
I think the opportunity to speak back to these very narrow processes and the opportunity to insist on their merits was important. I don't claim I was not leading the research. I was merely working for the group that I was working with a funding agency at the time, but in a sense, insisting on the importance from a position of relative power of my own in terms of being kind of located inside a government institution and saying, this is important, this is not silly, this should not be derided, and we have a lot to learn from the practices of these communities, was an important message that at the time wasn't getting out there as often as it should.
Based on what you've said, what do you think history is? What does it serve to do? This is the harder part. You're going to have to maybe do some more deep thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think history, it helps us to situate the present, I think, in really important ways. It helps us, for example, going back to my reference to the hockey stick graph, a kind of hot, sunny day in October. October last year, we had 3 consecutive days of over 30 degrees, and it was the first time that had ever happened in Montreal. You could look at it one way and say, amazing, I can go out in shorts and a t-shirt in early October and like hang out in the park. But when we put that into historical context, we can see just how absurd it is to be kind of experiencing those kinds of weather events when cast in the light of 1,000 years of kind of recorded weather record. So it helps us to situate the present. I think it helps us to understand how we've reached the present in terms of looking at the shape of the curve and its acceleration and the degree to which it has kind of shot up. And going back to this just as a sort of a point of reference on it, shows us just how dramatic our effect has been on the world. And that may not be observable without kind of looking back to how things were, you know, at a time that predates any of us on this planet, for instance. And I guess it helps us to have more difficult conversations about the present when we start to look at what we've lost. Another area that I look at is biodiversity loss and extinction. And when we look at the pace of extinction happening as we speak, not in some kind of like National Geographic kind of past issue that we looked at, but you know, kind of in real time, I think it invites us to have very difficult conversations about what we value now by looking at what we've lost, what we've exchanged it for in some ways. And when we talk about the sort of the impact of, for example, development, industrialization on our environment, on particular nations and peoples, and so on, I think history forces us to look quite critically at the present and ask tough questions about it.
Very interesting. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but history for you seems to be retroactive in a way, or history seems to be more focused on the past and leans towards the past to be able to look at what's happening right now as opposed to being more future oriented. There's a sense of some kind of trauma in the way you're talking about history. History is traumatic. So you're looking to the past and there's some kind of unresolved trauma where you can't necessarily make peace with prior times and be more in the present and future oriented.
I think what I would say is, yes, there's a lot of trauma that I would sort of say, like those of us who are working on environmental change and sustainability issues, I think often we look at the sort of the extent of the impact we've had on people and planet in what is just a few generations worth of time, and are like shocked and appalled by the sort of, if you will, the tragedy that has unfolded in that way. Whether we can look at that and kind of discern the future, I think is less clear. And I mean, that's maybe a sense of hope, is that like, these paths aren't necessarily linear, that there's another very well-known visual within the climate change world, which is these curves of future CO2 emissions, and that sort of depart from the current curve that we're on in different directions depending on the choices we make down the road. And they can be very sharp departures that kind of dramatically transform what the future looks like compared to today, to very unsatisfyingly small kind of departures that aren't going to change very much about the future, that might make it a little bit better, might help us avoid the worst of what the future might hold, but ultimately don't address the root kind of issues that we're dealing with. And so because of those, like, there's not a single future. There are multiple pathways that are out there kind of in the future. And so I think many of us kind of avoid trying to look at the past and sort of read a unified or singular future that's likely to unfold from it. But it is, I think, about understanding kind of how we got to where we are, the choices that got us to where we are today, and what those might mean for the different kinds of futures that we may or may not be able to create for ourselves down the road is an important role for history. It's interesting that historians, I think, in many ways, aren't a big part of the conversation around climate and sustainability, particularly in the international climate research community. And I think there's a lot of potential for a bigger role in those conversations, because I think the toolbox of kind of historical analysis and historical studies would bring us a lot of benefit.
In the past 2-3 years or a little longer, there's been a growing interest among history educators in the concept of the Anthropocene. So they're trying to come up with different ways of bringing these realities that you just mentioned to the history classroom.
Yeah.
I'm going to push a little more. Would one extreme vision of the future be we're going to end up in spaceships? And why bother about climate change? Why not put our energy in preparing ourselves?
Mars exploration.
Exploration.
Look who's holding the reins of power in the U.S. on the near horizon, and we may see Mars exploration being the sort of less of a fantasy and more of a reality. I mean, here's what I would say is one of the mottos of the climate advocacy movement is there is no planet B, and I continue to hold that to be true. That responsible stewardship and relational, being in relation on our planet means owning up to, taking responsibility for, being accountable to the sort of the many forms of life that surround us, and that abdicating that responsibility by sort of saying, well, we'll just go find somewhere else to colonize, strikes me as a very sad kind of prospect for the future.
Well said. So far what you've discussed about history seems to take place at a broader level or at a collective level. Would you say that history functions in a similar way at the individual level? Is there a difference?
Yeah, I don't think we can make sense of these things that happen at the big global level without being able to sort of locate it within our lived kind of present. I don't know that reading, Michael Mann's Hockey Stick is going to mean much to anyone without being able to sort of like find themselves on it, find the year of their birth on this kind of atmospheric concentration hockey stick graph, or looking at projections of future climate scenarios and being able to find your community on it and what the sort of possible weather and climate scenarios of 2080 would look like in terms of what your summer afternoons in your backyard would look like, or the winter activities that you once enjoyed that become less and less possible. So I do think that part of, as humans, we interpret global things through our lived experience. We can't just look at them as kind of like, scenes that are playing out in front of us. The connectedness, and I think that's actually one of the things that people work on climate change education have struggled to do, is to build the sense of connected, to get beyond just sort of conveying numbers and figures and facts, and getting into kind of personal connectedness to these issues in ways that motivate not necessarily fear and doom, but actually commitment to act and commitment to do something.
Very interesting. So based on what you've said, is history a good thing or is it a bad thing? Or is it both?
History as a sort of as a lens, as a set of tools for understanding the past, I think is vitally important. It helps us, it's essential in making sense of our present. Whether our behaviors through history is a totally different question. And I mean, I think that's open to discussion, but certainly the use of history and the tools of history and sort of history as a sort of space for educating strikes me as vitally important for all sorts of domains, including, as I was saying, kind of things around environment and science and sustainability.
Blane Harvey, thank you so much.
Thanks.